All right, part two, here we go. As in South America and Mesoamerica, cities took shape at the hubs of trading networks all across North America. The largest was Cahokia along the Mississippi River near modern-day East St. Louis, Illinois. A city of about 15,000, it approximated the size of London at the time. Farmers and hunters settled in the region around 600 CE, attracted by its rich soil, its woodlands for fuel and game, and its access to the trading artery of the Mississippi. Eventually, fields of maize and other crops fanned out toward the horizon. The hoe replaced the trusty digging stick, and satellite towns erected granaries to hold the increased yields. Now Cahokia became a commercial center for regional and long-distance trade. The hinterlands produced staples for Cahokia's urban consumers, and in return, Cahokia's crafts rode inland on the backs of porters and to distant markets in canoes. The city's woven fabrics and ceramics were especially desirable. In exchange, traders brought mica from the Appalachian Mountains, seashells and shark's teeth from the Gulf of Mexico, and copper from the upper Great Lakes. Cahokia became more than an importer and exporter. It was the exchange hub for an entire regional network, trading in salt, tools, pottery, woven stuffs, jewelry, and ceremonial goods. Dominating Cahokia's urban landscape were enormous mounds, thus the Cahokians' nickname Mound People. These earthen monuments reveal a sophisticated design and careful maintenance. Their builders applied layers of sand and clay to prevent the foundations from dying and cracking. It was from these artificial hills that the people paid homage to spiritual forces. Building this kind of infrastructure without draft animals like oxen, hydraulic tools, no hydraulic tools, or even wheels, there were no wheels for this, was labor intensive, so the Cahokians recruited neighboring people to help. A palisade around the city protected the metropolis from marauders. Little is known of the port city, Cahokia's political and economic structure, but it stood as the largest settled community in what is now the United States until surpassed in population by New York and Philadelphia around 1800. In other areas of eastern North America, hundreds of tribes inhabited towns and villages scattered from the Gulf of Mexico to present-day Canada. Groups frequently warred with one another to obtain goods, seize captives, or take revenge for the killing of relatives. They conducted diplomacy and made peace. The 15th century saw the introduction of more centralized authority when various leagues or confederations emerged in an effort to bring order to local regions. The Choctaw, Cherokee, and Chickasaw of the Southeast each united dozens of towns in loose alliances. In present-day New York and Pennsylvania, 5 Iroquois peoples, the Mohawk, Oneida, Cayuga, Seneca, and Onondaga, formed a great league of peace, bringing a period of stability to the area. A council made up of 5 groups met annually to coordinate behavior toward outsiders. As diverse as these many groups were, Indian societies in North America did share certain common characteristics. Religious ceremonies were a part of everyday life, often directly related to farming and hunting. They believed that sacred spirits could be found in all kinds of living and inanimate things, such as animals, trees, plants, water, and wind. Religious ceremonies aimed to harness the aid of supernatural forces to serve the interests of man. In some groups, hunters performed rituals to placate the spirits of the animals they killed. Other religious ceremonies attempted to secure the powers of nature, to secure abundant crops, or fend off evil spirits. Indian villages also held elaborate religious rites, participation in which helped define the boundaries of community membership. In all Indian societies, those who seemed to possess special abilities to invoke supernatural powers, shamans, medicine men, and other religious leaders, held positions of respect and authority. Native religion did not pose a sharp distinction between the natural and the supernatural, or secular and religious activities. In some respects, religion was not that different in North America than in Europe. Most Indians held that a creator stood atop a spiritual hierarchy. Nonetheless, nearly all Europeans arriving in the New World quickly concluded that Indians were in dire need of being converted to a true Christian faith. Equally alien in European eyes were Indian attitudes toward property. The countless miscommunications regarding land ownership led to many conflicts and the displacement of Native peoples. Numerous land systems existed among Native Americans. Generally, however, village leaders assigned plots of land to individual families for use for a season or more, and groups claimed specific areas for hunting. Unclaimed land remained free for anyone to use. Families, quote, owned the right to use the land, but they did not own the land itself. Indians saw land, the basis of economic life for both hunting and farming societies, as a common resource, not an economic commodity. Nor were natives interested in the accumulation of wealth and material goods. In fact, there are several European accounts describing the natives as poor because they didn't possess vast material wealth. Status certainly mattered to Indian societies. Some chiefs and leaders lived more splendidly than average families, but often status was measured by the willingness to share goods with others rather than hoarding them for themselves. The system of gender relations also differed strikingly from Europe. The Cherokee, for example, conceived of their world as a system of categories that opposed and balanced one another, and gender was no different. Women balanced men just as summer balanced winter, plants balanced animals, and farming balanced hunting. Membership in a family defined women's lives, but they openly engaged in premarital sexual relations and could even choose to divorce their husband. Most societies were matrilineal, meaning that they centered on clans or kinship groups in which children became members of the mother's family, not the father's. Tribal leaders were almost always men, but women played an important role in certain religious ceremonies, and female elders often helped to select male village leaders and took part in tribal meetings. Cherokee men did not dominate women, and women were not subservient to men. Men knew little about the world of women. They had no power over women and no control over women's activities. Women had their own arena of power, and any threat to its integrity jeopardized cosmic order. Indian women owned dwellings and tools, and a husband generally moved to live with the family of his wife. In the event of a divorce, the husband left his wife's house and returned to the home of his mother or sister. In Indian societies, men contributed to the community's well-being and demonstrated their masculinity by success in hunting or, in the Pacific Northwest, by catching fish. Because men were frequently away hunting, women took responsibility not only for household duties, but for most agricultural work as well. Among the Pueblo of the Southwest, however, where there was less hunting than in the East, men were the primary cultivators. So, how did Native peoples understand the concept of liberty? Many Europeans saw Indians as embodying freedom. The Iroquois, wrote one colonial official, held, quote, such absolute notions of liberty that they allow no kind of superiority of one over another, and banish all servitude from their territories, end quote. Most colonizers quickly concluded that Indians were barbaric in part because they did not appear to live under established governments or fixed laws and had no respect for authority. They are born, live, and die in a liberty without restraint, wrote one religious missionary. Indeed, the familiar modern understanding of freedom as personal independence and private property ownership had little meaning in most native societies. But Indians certainly had their own ideas of freedom. While buying and selling slaves was unknown, small-scale slavery existed in some Indian societies. So too did the idea of personal liberty as the opposite of being held as a slave. Indians would bitterly resent the efforts of some Europeans to reduce them to slavery. For Native peoples, kinship ties were far more important than individual autonomy. In Indian culture, group autonomy and self determination, and the mutual obligations that came with a sense of belonging and connectedness, took precedence over individual freedom. Ironically, the coming of Europeans, armed with their own language of liberty, would make freedom a preoccupation of American Indians as a direct result of the process by which they were reduced to dependence on the colonizers. On the eve of colonization, Europeans held different ideas of freedom, the most common being a moral or spiritual condition and less a political or social status. Freedom meant abandoning a life of sin and embracing the teachings of Jesus Christ. This idea of Christian liberty had no connection to later ideas of religious tolerance. Every nation in Europe had an established church that decreed what forms of religious worship and belief were acceptable. Dissenters faced persecution by the state as well as condemnation by church authorities. Religious uniformity was thought to be essential to public order. In its secular form, the equating of liberty with obedience to a higher authority suggested that freedom meant not anarchy, but obedience to the law. Within families, men exercised authority over their wives and children. According to the widespread legal doctrine of coverture, when a woman married, she surrendered her legal identity, which became, quote, covered by that of her husband, hence the name. Everywhere in Europe, family life depended on male dominance and female submission. European ideas of freedom still bore the imprint of the Middle Ages when liberties meant formal, specific privileges such as self-government, exemption from taxation, or the right to practice a particular trade granted by royal decree or contract. The native and European concepts of freedom were very much at odds with each other, which had a major impact on the group's interactions and treatment of each other. For most of the United States' short history, attempts have been made to change, erase, and minimize the long tenure of Native culture and history. The quote, decline of Native people is embedded in contact history, largely because scholars have focused on military defeat and land loss. This was just a brief look into the rich and vast history of Native Americans, a history that has often been left out in an effort to delegitimize their Aboriginal status. And with that, we come to the end of part 2. Part 3 will pick up with a focus on Europe before contact with North America.